It is wonderful to see so many friends, and thank you all for coming. And first of all, I want to thank Mark Bartlett, the head librarian, and for creating these wonderful programs. And Carolyn Waters has just done a marvelous job, really getting all of us together. And Jenny Lawrence, a marvelous woman whom I've just met, who's made this evening really possible for us. So we're starting. People are always asking me, well, first I should say, when I tell people I'm editor of the Hudson Review, they always ask me, where are you upstate? And I always have to remind people that the Hudson River is also in Manhattan. So I'm just going to very quickly tell you a little bit about how the Hudson Review began. You have there on your left Frederick Morgan at the age of 26 and Joe Bennett, same age. This is a photograph of the two boys who were the two founding editors in Time magazine just before their first issue came out in April 1948. And Time magazine predicted, there was an article about several little magazines, and they predicted that they thought that the Hudson Review was the one that was going to last. And 5 years ago, they ran a second piece saying, we were right. So, actually, the way it all began, it began at Princeton University when Fred Morgan and Joe Bennett were in their junior year. The university hired Alan Tate to give the first creative writing course at Princeton. And if anyone knows what's going on at Princeton now, they have an enormous department of creative writing. But at that time, everyone looked down on Alan Tate because they thought it was kind of a gut course. But he taught these boys really well. And they became the editors of the Princeton Literary Magazine. They all graduated in January of 1943 in an agreement with the government that they could stay that long, but then they all had to go in the armed services. So as they left, Alan Tate said, if you boys make it through the war and get back to New York, you should start your own literary magazine. And that's what happened, and we're still going now. The first office was in the trustees' room of the Morgan family's soap factory called Sapolio Soap, and it was on West and Bank Street on the corner of West Street, and it was in the West Village, and that's why it's called Hudson Review. In 1970, Fred and I were very active in the first Earth Day celebration in New York City. And at that time, we did our first issue on this topic called Poetry and Ecology. And it featured Wendell Berry, who was the only writer in that issue, who was also in this issue. And always when we do an anniversary issue, I like to find a new theme, something to kind of center the issue. And one article came in by Dean Flower, a professor at Smith College, one of our advisory editors, on the environmental interpretation of Moby Dick. And I love the article, it's in the issue. And I thought, I wonder if I can make a whole issue around this theme and revisit the whole idea of the environment and of the ecology. And so the whole purpose of it is really to show that there is great literature, and I'm not talking about polemical, global warming and all of that, but that there's great literature that still engages the environment and ecology in the same way that Thoreau, Emerson, Muir, and Carlson did it. And I think that everyone in this issue has more than that tremendous goal. So I just want to, because I never like to do anything with having Fred Morgan somehow part of it, and I just would like to read the quote that he wrote in his editorial for the Poetry and Ecology issue. Because he said, we believe that a literary review, by performing its function conscientiously, can contribute to the deeper changes taking place in society and culture, and help us to understand and evaluate them. And so tonight we're going to have marvelous readings by 4 writers in the issue. We're going to begin with, I'm going to introduce everyone now, and then we'll just go from one to the other. We're beginning with Laurie Olin, who will be reading from an Alaskan Reverie, his illustrated boyhood memoir of Alaska in the 1940s and 50s. He's a renowned landscape architect and recipient, just recently, of the 2013 Thomas Jefferson Foundation Medal in Architecture. It's particularly wonderful knowing that we have a landscape architect who has gotten the architecture medal. and we all know him because of his work at Bryant Park, Columbus Circle, and his firm is now doing the new landscape in front of the Metropolitan Museum. Tess Lewis will be reading from her translation of the Swiss poet Philippe Jaccottet and his notebook called Seedtime. And she's one of my most valued advisory editors and an award-winning translator from French and German. Peter Wortsman, who also published a memoir this year, will be reading from his new translations of the Grimm's fairy tales, forthcoming from Archipelago Books. Now, we selected fairy tales as the fiction for this issue because their theme is always about if you cooperate with nature, nature will cooperate with you. And that's pretty much the theme of all the stories. And finally, Antonio Muñoz Molina will be reading from his memoir, The Lighthouse at the End of the Hudson. And we're absolutely thrilled to have this piece because this pays tribute very much to our origins. And it's about his walks along the Hudson River. Mr. Molina is a very distinguished novelist, and he has just received the 2013 Jerusalem Prize in Literature and has just recently returned from the ceremony in Israel. And his illustrations for his piece are by his stepson, Miguel Sanchez Lindo. So we're going to begin with Laurie Olin.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you everyone at the lovely library. About ecology, when I wrote something that Paula asked me what I do, and it was a rather stream of consciousness bit about, it's actually more about cultural landscapes because I decided that's what I sort of do, so I'll start. Did you ever catch a whale? A boy asked my dad the summer I was 12 when we came out to the States to visit my grandparents. I was surprised by his question, since we lived in the interior of Alaska, hundreds of miles from the ocean. Until then, it hadn't dawned on me how little people knew about the size and nature, the sheer extent and enormous diversity of the terrain and inhabitants of Alaska. It was irritating to read in our third grade geography book that people in Alaska lived in igloos made of ice, when at the time I was sitting in a 3-story concrete steam-heated Art Deco public school in Fairbanks that was built by the WPA. No one I knew lived in an igloo. I didn't think anyone in Nome or Point Barrow or even Kotzebue or Koyukuk did either, which was true enough in a way. On the other hand, I learned later that the word igloo was Inuit. We still said Eskimo then. It was Inuit for shelter. It was used generically to cover many forms of dwelling, from the partially buried stone, sod, timber, and walrus hide covered houses built along the Bering Sea and Arctic Ocean, to the temporary hemispherical shelters made from cut slabs of thick crusted snow, not really ice blocks, made by hunters and travelers when on the trail or out on the Arctic ice pack. Snow is not very interesting or easy to draw, nor is cold. Also, as often happens, many of one's favorite or even most important experiences aren't recorded, simply because there wasn't time, or it seemed as they would always be around, and there would be infinite time to draw later. All forms of history are partial. So too with sketches done in the moment and not conceived of as a diary. Later in the piece, I talk about events that used to happen in the spring festivals and dog sled races in Fairbanks in the 40s that preceded the more contemporary Iditarod modern race. So part of that description says, old-time freight drivers in ankle-length fur parkas and fur hats with long leather bullwhips organized the drivers and teams to depart in order. What seemed truly special were the teams of dogs. Dozens of teams of these handsome animals would be scattered all along the river, curled up in lines and clusters in the snow, noses tucked under the curl of their tails, exhausted from running 35 to 40-mile legs in a multi-day race. There were always dogs around everywhere, one was in Alaska. Having joined humans at some point in the late Neolithic times, they were useful to have around, given the prevalence of wild animals and the need for their help at times. They also provided company for people on their own, often in trying circumstances. There were all sorts of dogs, most notably huskies, Siberians, and Malamutes, as well as dogs commonly associated with hunting, such as pointers, retrievers, setters, and spaniels. In the 1940s, sled dogs were still in use for hauling freight in the interior and in western and northern Alaska. Racing for fun and money was just beginning. Kennel clubs with registered breeds weren't yet on the scene, so the dogs used for hauling tended to be big, heavy, and to my eyes, fearsome-looking mixed-breed creatures. The common husky at the time was a relatively short, stocky dog with brown or yellow eyes. They tended to be tan or brown with beige chests. Malamutes, our high school mascot, were tall and rangy, with black and on their backs and gray on the white undersides. Their facial markings were inevitably black masks of sorts, and their eyes were brown. Of all the somewhat domesticated dogs, they most closely resembled wolves in their height and their length. Siberian Huskies were smaller, thin, pale gray, and built with pale gray and buff, with distinctive pale blue eyes. Many people in Fairbanks between 1946 and 1950 still kept teams of dogs. One that I remember clearly was that of Jackie Landry. Leonard Seppala had left his dogs to her when he left town and retired to Tacoma, Washington a few years earlier. Seppala, a Norwegian immigrant, was the crucial driver who mushed 340 miles round trip through a raging blizzard across the ice of Norton Sound and through the interior from Nome to Nenana and back to carry the diphtheria serum that stopped the epidemic there in 1925. Jackie, like many in town, was still outraged. The credit for this feat in the press stateside had been given to a man who only carried the serum from Fairbanks to Nenana, only 55 miles distant, and that a statue had been erected in New York City's Central Park to honor Balto, the wrong dog, instead of Totogo, Seppala's lead dog, whom he was forced to retire after the exploit due to the strain of the experience. I'll end with this. The Alaska flag was designed in an intuitive stroke of genius by a 13-year-old Aleut boy in an orphanage in Seward in a contest in 1927. It's blue and gold, two colors I associate most with the territory. The flag shows the Big Dipper, Ursa Major, the large bear, and Polaris, the North Star. How apt. No color is more present in the north. The huge blue sky of day and night, combined with the color of the mineral that drew tens of thousands to the wilderness, to the streams, the gold fields, the frontier camps, and the towns. So too, beneath the omnipresent heavens throughout the extent of Alaska are countless lakes, rivers, bays, and the ocean with their ever-changing shades, deep fjords and kettle holes of blue. There are as well the blue and miles of iris in annual drifts in the estuaries, and the state flower, the forget-me-not, with its tiny pale blue blossoms, in contrast with the scale and crushing weight of icy blue glaciers. This pale, spooky blue at the heart of the ancient ice is oddly similar to that of the small and intent eyes of Siberian Huskies. The most common color one sees at a social gathering in the summer is that of blue. Blue jeans, denim jackets, bib overalls, blue work shirts, blue windbreakers, and parka shells. In the interior and Arctic winter, at times the sky, when not dark, is either a bluish haze above a pinkish cream horizon or a golden shimmer of light in fine crystals. Cobalt, ultramarine, cerulean, aqua, slate, chalky blues with tinges of red and purple, with hints of green and brown, unimaginable and familiar blues in all the seasons and weather. Overhead, underfoot, in the distance, pale and intense blue. Early images and depictions of the North were almost always in black and white as a result of the paper and ink, as well as of the printing and the engraving for the press. Early photographs in books and journals by Arctic explorers and adventurers were also in black and white, at times profoundly beautiful with their velvety blacks and sharp whites. I'm thinking particularly of the work of Bradford Washburn. Even so, there are generous tans, there are greens, tans, ochres, browns, occasional reds, even startling whites among the animals and landscapes. While spring floods in regions of grasses, shrubs, and trees, and turf, after only a brief time in a palette that ranges from dusty pale straw through yellow to brilliant gold. Whether the long golden haze of this midnight sun that bathes the entire north in the evening for several months, or the brilliant reflections from peaks as it sets at other times, or the color of the hills in the interior in autumn as the birches and heath turn, or the color of the clouds of dust and insects that blow across the vast river deltas and bars north of the Alaska Range, or the speckled chests of meadow larks and spruce hens with a ring of amber around their pupils. Gold is the complement to the omnipresence of blue. White, to an artist, is often a starting situation, the color of paper or a prime canvas. Once it is covered, no matter how lightly, it's gone and it can't be recovered. White is frequently thought of as the absence of color. To science and physics, of course, it's the presence of all colors. A fact that seems counter to our experience in practical lives. In winter, however, snow can remind us of this truth, albeit often in subtle ways that we rarely stop to observe, since they are most obvious during the daily ritual of sunrise and sunset, which near the Arctic Circle occurs commonly in the midst of the workday throughout the winter, leading many to miss it and to not look up from their tasks at time. Like the iridescent feathers of some species of birds, snow has no color in itself. The dazzling colors we see in the spray and ice, snow and clouds are simply colors refracted by scores of miniature prisms from the pure, clear, invisible light spectrum. Life is possible on our planet because of the sun and water. In Alaska, a person annually experiences these two important phenomena in alternating extreme aspects of their possibilities. In November, December, January, February, one rises in the dark and goes to work or school in the dark. At some point in the mid to late morning, a little before noon, the sun comes up and skids along just above the horizon in the south, and then, before it even seems like afternoon, it sets, and one works and departs in the gloom. In the shoulder months, however, when there is still plenty of snow and it is clear and cold and the sun is beginning to climb halfway back up the sky, it can be dazzling. Then in late February and early March, on spectacular days, there isn't just one sun, but there can be 2 or 3 or even 4. These are the sundogs. Due to the refraction of light in what seems like a snow globe of infinitely fine-grained suspended ice crystals high in the atmosphere, the sun appears to have companions, other suns to its left and right, and on some more rare occasions, even below it and high enough. As a child, I thought they were magical and probably a lucky sign, especially when more than one appeared. Thank you.
Good evening. It has been my pleasure and immense privilege to write and translate for the Hudson Review for 20 years now, so almost a third of the 65 years. And I would like to thank Paula tonight for all the support, encouragement, and inspiration that she has given, not just me, but all her writers. I think I can speak for everyone. She gives it consistently, year in, year out, and in lavish proportions. It's really an amazing experience to be part of the Hudson Review family. And of course, that means I have to thank Ron. Where are you, Ron? Without whom the magazine would quite literally not be what it is, both physically and Madeline and Zach, of course, are unfailingly generous and patient, and I might say patient again. So thank you, all of you, for the wonderful magazine that you produce every 4 times a year. Philippe Jaccottet. I'm honored to be in this issue as a translator of Philippe Jaccottet, both to be his translator and to have my work appear in the company of the wonderful writers Paula has gathered together. The Swiss poet Philippe Jaccottet is almost 90 years old now, and for the past 7 decades, he has kept a journal alongside his almost 20 volumes of poetry. And he calls this project La Semaison, or the Seedtime, taking his title from the literary definition of semaison, which is the natural dispersion of grain, his seeds, his idea being that in his notebooks he gathers grains of observation that he sees around him, both ideas, observations, images that, if properly cultivated, he can later work into poetry. And if you read his notebooks alongside his poems, you see how they function as nurseries for his poems, or as an artist's sketchbook where an image or an idea is reworked from different angles and different contexts. Jaccottet is rare among contemporary poets in that he can combine, very rich central imagery with metaphysical and philosophical speculation. But because his poetry is always tied to very concrete experiences and imagery, it never becomes inaccessible or overly cerebral. So I'll read a few of the excerpts from his carnet, and I hope it'll give you a sense of this balance in his work, and also we'll celebrate Paula's wonderful issue on literature and the environment. So, 1960, February. The mountain always appeared with traces of snow on its peak above the Rebirth road, like something Greek. A snowy owl's nest, a thin banner or Tibetan prayer flags, a place high in the thin air, white bird above bare trees, or the elbow of the distant river at the base of the barely green slope. You can see a watery shade of light green. There are semi-precious stones of this color, jade, opals, and 1 or 2 vivid lines of foam slanting across it to show its seemingly stationary, rapid movement. Surging waters of late winter. And on the banks, the bare trees, their smooth trunks, a gray turned slightly yellow or pink in the weak light, and their branches reaching upwards and straight, unlike the twisted, knotty branches, the twisted, knotty trees that live amidst the rocks. A place of fragile ascension, a fog of branches, so different from the clusters, the portentous circles of oaks covered with ivy, with their black force, their chains, their heavy grills retaining or defending some unknown austerity, some upturned stone, well or tomb. Circles, solemn, grave assemblies around a silence, and the hoopoes or sultana birds live in the branches, places to stay, to wait, motionless, with a sovereign resolve, while all along the river, everything is in motion. Water, smoke, a lane under the light arch of vapors, a shining road. Like 2 lives, 2 possible ways of thinking, one naughty, attentive, reflective, and tied to the night, to stone, druidic, bent over the mouth of the earth, and the other, lively, light, almost insolent or nimble, along the glittering thread of days. Almond trees, foam, snows, peaks of coolness, luminous plumage, swans. 1962, July. I have not yet found a way to describe how this world glows at dawn, the days of sun and north wind, while the mountains are weightless and blue. light that rhymes, in the south wind with dust, in the north wind with river. Dusty light, mirroring, trickling light, arid, parching light, scintillating light. There is something to be said about this sense of radiance, of weightlessness, of transparency, about the desire to walk in these gardens, these meadows, at the base of these mountains, about the irresistible sense of paradise. It would be hard to explain. Primordial elements, morning, the freshness before the day's impending heat, perfect weather, cloudless, the east, the mountain, foliage, glittering like water, the transcendent, mountains like a blue border, weightless, hardly mountains anymore, just blue softness, a cradle, because the details are indistinct, a blue cloth, not even, a blue border, the idea, a blue boundary, the idea of a boundary. 1969, October. At the break of dawn, the dark green of a fig tree, the yellow of a tree further off, stains of vines in the mist, severe colors, silence, muteness rather. You discover a more obscure aspect of the world, of the garden, something that disarms me, renders me speechless, these colors and the mist before sunrise. Afternoon, under a gray, or more often blue-black, soot-colored sky, the intensity of the light greens, the yellow of the vines or the reeds, the shades of rust or purple stealing over the orchards. Never have I seen such richness kindled by black. Flames, sparks all around. Not a celebration as in June, but something more solemn, more internalized, as if space were a room. An opulence, a richness on a dark background that is not the night, thick, opaque, brown, or the clouds of soot, of ominous ink, a military celebration, a conqueror's glory. This is also the time when the earth reappears almost everywhere, wood and earth, the very beautiful moment of earth, of soot, crossed by two pigeons whiter than milk. 1971, May. To burn in spirit all these books, all these words, all these innumerable, subtle, profound, mortal thoughts, to open oneself up to the falling rain, swarming with gnats, insects, to this country of gray and green, to the various species of trees, of green, to a creaking in the stone wall or wooden door. 1974, March. Do not let it pass unless you repeat this to yourself. The longest, mildest evenings, the snow soon faded into the gray tree blurs the mountain and sky. Closer, the cool earth in the garden, and, as if suspended above, the light green spirea shrubs, the day's dwelling, that cool, vigorous thing, the time just before spring, a space still large, an even greater light, the leaves' effervescence, bread for the eyes. And do not forget the pink peach trees against the tilled earth, or other, smaller ones between the dark cypress nurseries. Is there another marvel here that I've never noticed? What is it? Lightness, coolness, fragility? Should I let myself start again with the endless stomping that only destroys what cannot simply be transcribed or copied? Earth, flowers, cypresses that can easily be called black but are not at all funereal, like bushy ramparts against the fires that are not fires. I think that what catches fire here is time, its passage, the way it ignites in everything yellow, and the earth below, behind, is what is ageless. Not abstractly eternal, but it is what endures, the expanse. Meanwhile, the chestnuts are budding precociously. The flower that pierces the hard bark of the ground, that splits rock. No doubt there is, indeed, something to this connection, this relationship between flowering trees and time, the swiftness of time, that which takes fire from the rapidity of its flight. But be careful not to push too hard on this sort of translation. The illusion must be slight and swift. You must still sense the air, the gardens, the clouds, and the marvelous March rain. So brief, unexpected, and fruitful. Quick. The word quick has a connection here too, and yet no haste, no fervor. Difficult. Nothing is more difficult. Not the flesh, nor the angels, nor dawn. Despite the temptation to resort to these comparisons. Every spring, I find myself caught in the same loop, the same trap. Just the other day, from the train outside of Tarascon, I saw the beauty of the large orchards surrounded by cypresses, the trees just touched with purple against the high black fences, which the great expanse of these orchards made even more striking. There was a birth, dark, silent, of color, as when fire ignites. There was a solemnity too. Should one think of music? The enclosure of cypresses, in prose, a form on the landscape. What troubled and confused me in the Eastern Pyrenees was the absence of this rigor. Rilke wrote of this in connection with Toledo. Some landscapes seem to have begun on their own, within themselves, the realization, the transposition that the painter would have imposed upon them were he to tackle them. Their spiritual meaning already shone through, decanted within them. They are mirrors that sometimes show us our hidden faces. And so it is. I am surrounded by fugitive, shattered images with no connection to each other. They fade as they pass, like birds, and I wish I could gather them once more, lest I be the one shattered by time. Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank Paula for including me in this distinguished company, and I'm honored to be celebrating one of America's great literary magazines in this historic space. I feel somewhere wafting around me the voices of Rip Van Winkle, Bartleby the Scrivener, and Holly Golightly, and I'm thrilled to be reading in that company. Since we are celebrating ecology and time, I want to extend the sense of ecology in reading from my translation of, a new translation of the Brothers Grimm, to a sense of birth, death, and rebirth in all its various forms. I think the Grimms need no introduction, but they perhaps need a rediscovery, a cleansing of the dust of niceness that has been wafted around them. So I'm going to begin briefly with a few remarks from my afterword, and then instead of reading you a whole story, I'm going to tease you and tantalize you with a little excerpt of what I think is the rawest of the stories. These stories tap the unfiltered fundament of the collective unconscious as few others have before or since, dredging up ugliness along with beauty, bravery with cowardice, kindness with cunning. In uttering the unutterable, fairy tales retain the ring of truth, which is why they have weathered the whimsies of successive social theories and political ideologies, and the passing of fads and fashions of child rearing, and why they are likely to stand the test of time for years to come. As the Grimm's Märchen remind us, life is full of pitfalls and traps, with ogres and witches at every turn. Nature keeps teaching seemingly self-evident truths that those inclined to listen. While the dragon of old may have gone extinct, global warming and drought are two intertwined modern monsters. Honeybees risk extinction if some simpleton doesn't come along soon to heed their warning. And a bloodthirsty virus is on the loose, decimating the vulnerable. But there are hopeful signs. A handful of youths and maidens have been brave or foolhardy enough to take the genie by the tail and topple seemingly omnipotent oligarchs in the land of 1,001 nights. And others here at home have dared stand up to the 100-headed, fire-breathing dragon of multinational corporate greed. The rest of us children and adults, meanwhile, are forever getting bottled up in the infinite manifestations of our fears and furies. If there is wisdom in these seemingly simple tales, as I believe there is, it is in the promise of metamorphosis. Frog to prince, straw to gold, hedgehog to human, tailor to king, and the potential force of metaphor to lift the spell of the mundane and point the way to a magical tomorrow. I'm going to read you the beginning, the first few pages of a tale called The Juniper Tree, and this is not one of the tales that Disney immortalized, and you will see why. It happened long, long ago, more than 2,000 years gone by. There was a rich man who had a beautiful and God-fearing wife, and they loved each other very much, but they had no children, much as they badly wanted them. And the woman prayed so hard day and night, but still she had no children, not a one. Now in the yard in front of their house stood a juniper tree. One day in winter, the woman stood beneath it, peeling herself an apple. And as she peeled, she cut her finger, and the blood dripped into the snow. "Oh," said the woman with a deep sigh when she saw the blood in the snow, and suddenly felt overwhelmed with sadness. "If only I had a child as red as blood and as white as snow." Having let these words spill from her lips, she felt a great happiness, and she was certain it would come to pass. So she went back into the house, and after a month went by, the snow melted. After 2 months, everything was green. After 3 months, flowers blossomed from the ground. After 4 months, all the trees in the forest grew heavy with leaves, and the green branches were all entwined with one another. And the little birds twittered, so that the entire forest resounded with their song, and the blossoms fell from the trees. Then a 5th month had gone by, and she stood by beneath the juniper tree. It smelled so sweet, her heart nearly burst for joy, and she fell to her knees and was beside herself with emotion. And after the 6th month had passed, the fruit hung thick and plump, and she fell still. At the end of the 7th month, she picked all the juniper berries and gobbled them down so greedily it made her sick and solemn. The 8th month passed, and she called her husband to her. Weeping, she said to him, "If I die, bury me under the juniper tree." Then she felt greatly relieved and happy. At the end of the 9th month, she bore a child, as white as snow and as red as blood. And when she set eyes on the child, she was so glad that she died. They can't quite take emotions in these stories. Her husband buried her beneath the juniper tree, and he cried inconsolably. In time, he felt a little better, and although he still shed tears, at least his grief was bearable. And not long after that, he took another wife. With the second wife, he had a daughter, but the child he'd had with the first wife was a little son, and he was as red as blood and as white as snow. When the woman looked at her daughter, she loved her a lot. But then she looked at the little lad, and it gnawed at her heart to see him, as if he would forever stand in the way, and she couldn't stop thinking how to keep the inheritance out for her daughter. And the evil one wouldn't let up, so that she was altogether filled with hatred for the little lad. She kept shoving him around from one place to another, and slapped him here and whacked him there, so that the poor little fellow was frightened all the time. As soon as he came home from school, he could find no place of refuge from her wrath. Once, when the woman went up to her room, her little daughter came bounding up the stairs and said, "Mother, give me an apple." "Yes, my child," said the woman, and took a luscious-looking apple from the chest and gave it to her. The chest had a great big heavy lid with a large, sharp iron lock. You know what's coming. "Mother," said the little girl, "will my brother not get one too?" Uh-oh. The woman winced, but she said, "Yes, when he comes home from school." And when peering out the window, she saw him coming. It was as if the evil one grabbed hold of her, and she reached out and took back the apple from her daughter and said, "You shan't have one before your brother." Then she flung the apple back into the chest and locked it. Whereupon the little lad walked through the door, and the evil one made her speak sweetly to him. "My son," she said, "would you like to have an apple?" You know, apples are dangerous in fairy tales. Remember that? And she gave him such a nasty look. "Mother," said the little fellow, "how cross you look. Yes, give me an apple." She felt as if she had to convince him. "Come with me," she said, lifting the lid, "and pick out an apple." And when the little boy bent over, the evil one beckoned, and blam! She slammed the lid on so that his head was chopped off and landed among the apples. Riddled with fear at what she'd done, she thought to herself, "I've got to find a way to get out of this." Then she went up to her room, opened her chest of drawers, and pulled a white scarf out of the top drawer. Put the boy's head back on his neck, wrapped the scarf around it so that nobody could see what it was severed. I told you Walt Disney didn't do this one. Propped him up on a stool in front of the door and put the apple in his hand. Not long after that, Marlenekin, that's the daughter, comes over to her mother in the kitchen, who was standing by the fire, stirring and stirring a pot of hot water. "Mother," said Marlenekin, "my brother is seated by the door, all white in the face with an apple in his hand. I asked him to give me the apple, but he made no reply. The sight of him gives me the creeps." "Go back to him," said the mother, "and if he still says nothing, give him a cuff on the ear." So Marlenekin went and said, "Brother, give me the apple." But when he made no reply, she boxed his ear, whereupon his head fell off. Then she panicked and started crying and screaming, and she ran onto her mother and said, "Oh, mother, I knocked my brother's head off," and kept crying and crying and would not stop crying. "Marlenekin," said the mother, "what have you done? Better be quiet now if you don't want anyone to know. No point crying up spilled milk. We'll boil him up and make a stew." Then the mother took the little boy and hacked him into pieces, put the pieces in the pot, and prepared a stew. But Marlenekin stood beside her and kept crying and crying, and her tears fell into the pot so it needed no salt. Then the father came home, sat himself down at the table, and said, "Where is my son?" The mother served him a great big helping of stew, and Marlenekin wouldn't stop crying. The father asked again, "Where is my son?" "Oh," said the woman, "he took a trip to visit his mother's great uncle. He'll stay there for a while." "What in heaven's name is he doing there? He didn't even say goodbye to me." "Oh, well, he wanted to go so badly and asked if he could stay 6 weeks. I'm sure they'll take good care of him there." The man replied, "I'm so sad. It isn't right that he should have left without saying goodbye." Whereupon he started eating and said, "Marlenekin, why are you crying? Your brother will be back soon." Then he said, "Woman, this stew tastes so good. Give me more." And the more he ate, the more he wanted. And he said, "Give me more, and the two of you shall have none. It seems to me as if it were all mine." And And he ate and dropped all the bones under the table until he had gobbled it all up. Then Marlenikin went to her chest of drawers, drew her best silken scarf from the bottom drawer. There's Rebirth at the end, don't worry. And gathered all the bones, little and big, from under the table, bound them in her silken scarf, and hauled them out the door, where she wept bloody tears. She laid the bones out in the green grass under the juniper tree, and once she had done so, she felt a whole lot better and didn't cry anymore. After that, the juniper tree started to sway, and the branches spread farther and farther apart, and then came back together again, as if in a burst of joy, someone were clapping his hands. And it was as if a mist rose from the tree, and in the mist, a fire burned, and a beautiful bird flew out of the fire. It sang so sweetly, and flew high up in the air, and once it was gone, the juniper tree was again as before, and the cloth with the bones was gone. But Marlenikin felt so giddy and glad-hearted, as if her brother was still alive. Then she went cheerfully back into the house, sat down at the table, and ate. But the bird flew away, landed on the roof of a goldsmith's house, and started singing. My mother, she smote me. My father, he ate me. My sister, sweet Marlenikin, gathered all my little bonekins, bound them in a silken scarf, and lay them under the juniper tree. Tweet, tweet, I'm a little birdie, look at me. And if you want to know what happens, you'll have to buy the book.
This is a tough act to follow. Well, I'll start by saying thanks to Paula West and to Ron and to the Hudson Review for running this piece of mine, and also to my dear friend and colleague Martina Broner, who has translated it from Spanish into English, who is also here tonight. And of course my son, my stepson Miguel, who has done the beautiful drawings. This is this memoir. We can call it a memoir, has a particular origin, because I took to take long walks along the Hudson River a couple of years ago, because I had in mind a book that I was planning to write. So I found out that taking these long walks was good for my figuring out the book, and I was more or less at the beginning of the process of trying to more or less fumble around, finding the shape, the still unknown shape of the book, no? And every day I repeated this walk along the river with the book in my mind, and then something happened, that this book I was planning to write, little by little, faded away, because I was paying so much attention to the river itself and to the walking itself, that the walking took over my imagination. So I started taking notes, writing down things on a notebook, not knowing exactly what I would end up doing with it. But still, I kept writing, no? Because I happened to have a beautiful notebook with large sheets. Yeah, because the shape of a book, of a notebook, is kind of an invitation to write. No? So I started writing down things, jotting down things about my everyday, about the things I saw, the things I noticed, the people I run into, and little by little it took shape. And I forgot everything about the previous book, the one I went down to the river to think of. And this thing took over. And this is what I was trying to do is to, since I was taking these walks along the river, not exactly to describe the river, but somehow to convey the sense of the flow. I mean, the river drags so many things up and down, so many so much garbage and things and all type of debris, you know? And I thought of writing something that the writing should somehow resemble the flow of the river itself, no? So it is full of quotations and full of fragments of titles of books and fragments of poems. And it is, I repeat, a work in progress. Because I was talking with Paula about this issue of the Hudson Review, and I told her, well, I'm writing something that might somehow fit in your project, no? So she invited me to contribute this, and this is the first time it is published, because it has not yet been published in Spanish. So it's an original, it's been published before in English than in Spanish, no? So it is made of, at the moment, there are 60 short chapters, and I'll read a few of them, starting by the first one. And at the beginning, there's a quotation from Virginia Woolf, which fits quite well my purpose, no? She says in her diary, no? Which is the greatest school of writing that you can think of is Virginia Woolf's diary, no? She says, suppose one can keep the quality of a sketch in a finished and composed book. For some time, I went down to the edge of the Hudson to run along a path that then reached north to 125th Street and now extends up to the George Washington Bridge. Heading south, the path borders the river through Battery Park at the tip of Manhattan. My home is near the river on West 106th Street, named Duke Ellington Boulevard. Duke Ellington lived in the mansion around the corner on Riverside Drive. An old newsreel shows his funeral procession heading up Broadway to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. Almost every day, the weather allowed, I would pass Duke Ellington's mansion's corner in my running clothes and shoes, and I would cross the park, Riverside Park, to go down to the river's edge. At the park, the esplanade covers the tunnels for the railroad line that begins at Penn Station. 2. The vault of the bridge, almost a tunnel, frames the first sight of the Hudson, confined by the ugly apartment towers and the cliffs of New Jersey. A Wilhelm de Kooning painting is titled Door to the River. To push a door and suddenly find oneself before the glow of the river. At the end of this arch of shadow lies a brightness that changes every day. Great brightness of cloudy days, blinding on sunny mornings, red and golden in the afternoons, Arctic on snowy winter days when the landscape disappears underneath the whiteness and naked trees become the black scribbles of Henry Callahan's photographs. On sunny days, the river lights up beyond the arch of the tunnel like a sheet of steel waving in the wind. Spring, summer, autumn are the luxurious seasons of colors. Winter is the austere age of drawing. But David Hockney says that there is color in winter too. Quote, even in dull days, there is a lot of color if you look. The trees only go black when it rains. End of quote. 3. If you look. I will run and think I was seeing everything. It took me just a few years to realize I was barely noticing anything. A few years and the pain on my knee and the sole of my foot that forced me to stop running. How I've longed for the elastic pounding of heels against hard but not rigid soil that gives in gently under each step, or like asphalt. The passage from fatigue that seems undefeatable to a sudden burst of unexpected lightness. The flood of endorphins that widens the lungs and makes one sensitive to the smell and texture of air in dilated nostrils. Once I was running up the river's edge and a storm surprised me. It was summer, and I was grateful for the first tepid drops that hit my face, the smell that came out from the earth and the river. The agile fingers of the rain drummed across my shoulders, on my chest. The wet cotton of my shirt stuck to my skin. A moment later, My hair was dripping and my shirt was soaked. I shielded myself under an immense elm that covers the path with its crown. Towards the river, its branches reach over until they touch the water. Sheltered by the tree, I felt gratitude for this powerful and benevolent presence. The rain clinked against the leaves. Parallel to the path by the river flows the other incessant river of traffic on the West Side Highway. Beyond that, higher, over the crown of Riverside Park's oaks and maples, the towers of Riverside Drive are outlined as cliffs and lighthouses with rows of windows where the last red glow of the afternoon fades away. When the rain stopped, I continued to run, and I quickly recognized the pain in my knee and the sole of my foot. From that day on, I would look at the elm for a moment each time I ran past it, and almost greeted it like the friendly stranger one becomes used to recognizing on the street. When I ran, I did pay attention to the trees, and I liked knowing almost all of their names in Spanish and English. The eye truly discerns a tree only when we are aware of its name. The elms, the oaks, the acacias, the maples, the cherry trees that give their name to that stretch of the esplanade, the cherry walk. I will think about the tradition of trees as a source of wisdom in so many primitive cultures. I thought I saw the river. I absent-mindedly imagined its monotonous course to the sea. When I ran heading north, I could see the silhouette of the George Washington Bridge in the distance. Le Corbusier used to say that it was the most beautiful bridge in the world. I never went too far on these runs. I didn't even know that the path extended to its very columns, or that there is a lighthouse under the bridge that has been there since long before. Now that I know that the lighthouse is there, and I've visited it many times, my gaze has focused, and I can make out its shape from far away. We see things if we know they exist. I will see the silhouette of the bridge soften in the mist or sharpen in days of luminous clearness. While I ran, I will look at the flattened soil or the stretches of pavement ahead of me and at the buildings of Riverside Drive. The Riverside Church tower and the round structure of Graham's tomb served as a marker of distance covered. I didn't know that peregrine falcons nested on the top of the church tower. I didn't know that falcons in New York fed on sparrows and pigeons and on small rodents. I had never looked at a falcon, perched on a branch in front of me, still, his round eyes fixed on mine, sullen and condescending as a god, like the black obsidian falcons from the Egyptian wing at the Met. As I run, I will notice the things people dispose of as they leave the river's edge. Food containers, plastic bottles, soda cans, beer bottles, newspapers, plastic bags, religious pamphlets. A plastic bag or bottle takes about 500 years to decompose fully. I love the path so much, I was offended by the lack of respect towards a place of such beauty. Sometimes I will pick up a bottle or a can and take it to the nearest trash can, as a gesture of restitution to the path and the river, of respect to the elm that had sheltered me from the storm. Once, I carried a half-finished beer bottle, and the runners and cyclists that passed me shot disapproving glances in my direction. A wanton runner quenching his thirst with beer. But I didn't see that much. During that time, my own obsessions enclosed me, and I ran as if inside a bubble or a bottle. The obsession with keeping track of time as I ran, with how long it would take me to become exhausted, with making it as far as Graham's tomb, with feeling the beginning of pain in my knee or the sole of my foot. My own obsession with being foreign. Passports, visas, legal procedures, the wait for the green card. Faster runner, cyclist will leave me behind with a murmur of wheels after a warning bell. There is no stealthier machine than the bicycle. Or I will pass slow runners with faces red from exertion who seem to drain their last reserves of energy attempting to escape death as it trailed closely behind. The afternoon's final ray of sun will shine across the highest windows of buildings and just before it dissipated, it seems as if the stream was set ablaze. I kept meeting people along the river as well, and one day something happened that I would like to read you about. No, sorry. First, I'll read something about the name of the river. I've learned the name given to the Hudson by the Lenape people, who inhabited the island of Manhattan when the first Dutch settlers arrived. Mukeakantuk, river that flows in two directions, river that comes and goes. But the intensity of meaning weakens when it has to be distributed among more words. Mukeakantuk, río que va y vuelve. I had the reason for that name in front of me, and it took me long to see. I didn't see the river before me, but the abstract image of a river, the definition of a word. The Hudson sometimes goes to the sea, and other times comes back. Mukeakantuk. The word itself says it. It took walking there and transiently exiting the hermetic bottle of my obsessions to see that sometimes the river stream goes backwards, pushed by sea currents. That close to its end, it ceases being a river to become an estuary, and much of what I see is salt water. That, and not just because of the direction of the wind, is why it sometimes smells so powerful like the ocean on days when the tide and fog come from the south. The air tastes of salt and algae. The objects the river carries downstream come back the same way. The coming and going of its name is that of a breath, also that of the tides and of the seasons, systoles and diastole, night and day. Any object thrown in the river will remain there a long time, going up and down, returning just before reaching the ocean, a storm throwing them against granite blocks piled up at the shore, sent sailing by a high tide, the blow of a wave or a low tide leaving them once again stranded ashore, staying there for weeks or months. The sun dries them and gives them the texture of bone. I'll read you about this person I met once. When you walk along the river every day, you have a chance to meet a number of incredible people, believe me. A woman stands atop the concrete blocks that jut from the river's edge. People usually sit there to read, or to look at the water, or to type on an iPhone. There is also the occasional sunbather in the summer. One season, at that same spot, as I run, I will see an older man meditating in perfect lotus posture, his back straight, his legs crossed, the nape of his neck lightly angled, the palms of his hands on his lap, thumbs touching. Today, I see the woman who is so close to the edge, I'm afraid she might jump. She has her back to me. She holds something in her hands. Since I'm carrying my BlackBerry, it occurs to me to take a picture. I get closer and I see that she has thrown into the water whatever it was that she had in her hands. Something white, with thick pages, a notebook that sways on the foam of waves breaking by the shore. The woman turns and sees me. She has curly hair, a round and tranquil face. I say, "Can I ask you something?" She nods. "I saw you throwing something into the water. Could you tell me what it was?" "That's between the river and me," says the woman, polite but conclusive. "That's between the river and me." I continue my walk, and I hear somebody calling me. It's the woman with the notebook. "I'm sorry I was rude." "Why were you asking me that?" "I come to the river almost every day. I observe what people do." It was a manuscript of a book. I take notes and write drafts in that notebook. I have the complete book on my computer. Now that I have finished it, instead of keeping the notebook, I wrote it for the river. And I'll finish by reading the last chapter, short chapter, because of course the title is playing on the title of the wonderful Jules Verne novel, no? The Lighthouse at the End of the World. No? And this is a walk I'm taking almost by. Well, the first time I reached the lighthouse, Then walking. It takes an hour, more or less an hour, to get there from 106. Then, a bit closer, I distinguish the lighthouse, almost negligible at the foot of the colossal structure. The lighthouse at the end of the Hudson. The lighthouse at the limit of my walks along the shore. The lighthouse driven into living rock in an area where the river widens and currents create many simultaneous rivers within it. Where the tide lowers, revealing beaches that seem as if they belong to the remote geography of expeditions in adventure books, of names on world maps, beautiful names of places one will never see. Cabo de Hornos, Patagonia, Greenland, the small Alaska, I can say. The small lighthouse has the epic dignity of its own name and the resonance it creates. The lighthouse at the end of the world. The lighthouse I once visited on Cape Creus in Catalonia. Wind so strong it forced me practically to walk on all fours and to hold on the edge of a rock as it pushed me. Under the George Washington Bridge, by the lighthouse, feeling the trembling of traffic emanate from each one of the intersecting iron beams, I noticed something. The entire surface of the rocks is splattered with paint spots. Silver and ochre, red spots, streaks of paint, as in a Jackson Pollock painting. Drops that have fallen over the years when they paint the bridge beams to protect them against rusting. Ochre, red, silver, against the rough surface, the texture of pachyderm skin, against gravel, where a lowered gaze finds treasures and garbage, plastic lighters, plastic bottles, remains of driftwood. But there are also screws that have been dropped from the bridge. Screws painted the asphalt gray of aircraft carriers. Screws heavy as lead inside my pocket that feels as if they could crumble in my fingers, utterly crafted by rust and exposure to the elements. Thank you so much.
Literature and the environment, and we have copies for sale. We're at a tremendous sale price. They're usually $12. We're selling them for $5 a piece. Before we go out, I do want my staff to stand up. Ron Corey, who is with the magazine for 32 years, almost half the life of the magazine. Zachary Wood in the corner. We pay our interns, and right now I have a wonderful intern, Scott Bartley, standing in the back. Thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed reading it as much as we've all enjoyed doing it. So